Hi everybody, my name is Jen Paffenroth. I'm the Business Support Manager at IEC Thermo. Welcome to Wednesday webinar episode 9. If you are joining us on our live stream over at Facebook, we're glad you can join us today as well. We have some really special guests and industry experts from New West Genetics joining us, and IEC Thermo is glad to call them a strategic partner as well. New West Genetics has been breeding and developing hemp seed genetics for the last 7 years, focusing on a direct seeding solution for row crop farmers. So today we have Jenny Boyd and Rich Fletcher from the New West Genetics team joining us. We will, as usual, we'll have time for a live Q&A at the end of the webinar. So if you have any questions at any point today, write them in the Q&A section, and Jenny or Rich will get to answering them at the end of today's webinar. So I will turn it over to you guys now.
Okay, thanks, Jen. Appreciate it. So my name is Jenny Boyd. I'm with New West Genetics. As Jen said, I'm the Director of Business Development and Supply Chain. My counterpart, Rich. Rich, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, Rich Fletcher, Director of Breeding for New West Genetics and one of the founding partners.
So Rich and I are going to walk you through some slides today. I know there's a number of folks on the call, so if you have questions, I believe, Jen, the process is for them to just submit the questions to you online, right? And then you'll read those questions off at the end. So
Yes, that's exactly right.
We'll go ahead and roll through some information. What we wanted to share with you today is obviously there's a lot of conversation about hemp genetics over the course of the last 3 years, and what should I plant? Should I plant hemp at all? What should I plant? How do I plant it? How do I harvest it? We've heard a lot of questions, and Rich and I and our counterpart Daniel, who's our agronomist, who was unable to join us today because his wife has a brand new baby boy, or girl, I can't remember now.
The girl.
Baby girl.
Yeah.
So we are sorry that Daniel can't be here, but we've been on calls with farmers for the last 3 months, pretty solidly, and I'd say we talked to over 600 farmers between webinars and one-on-ones and small groups. And we get a lot of the same types of questions. And so we've put together some slides here with some pictures to kind of walk you through some things. Hopefully it'll help answer some of your questions. And then as we'd like to keep this some Q&A too. So we'll make sure that we limit the presentation time to leave a little bit of time at the end so you can ask your questions and we can get those answered. So we'll go ahead and jump in. We're going to focus on 3 areas today, and that is when we talk about Abound. Abound is our variety that we launched this year, which is a grain and CBD variety, and it is direct seeded, as Jen mentioned. So it's very unique. There are direct seeded genetics that are out there that people planted in 2019, and as I've talked to most growers, the germination rates were very poor, anywhere from 20 to 40%, but most people saying 20 to 30% was more common. So it was kind of hit or miss with what they were growing. There was also some direction to rogue, just like you would with feminized clones or seedlings. And so there was an awful lot of effort and time and labor spent trying to get out there and rogue males. We do not recommend that you rogue the males. We want the seed to germinate. We want it to also pollinate so that you're going to end up with grain and CBD and have 2 revenue streams. We're also doing research this year on the fiber that gets produced, because ours is more of a grain type of hemp, and so you're going to have some stock that's going to provide you with fiber, and we're doing some research on that this year as well to understand best uses for it, etc. Rich can share a little bit about that, but we'll know a whole lot more at the end of this growing season as trial data starts to come back in. So we're going to talk about the agronomics around Abound. We're going to talk about what claims we make and also what claims others make, and how do you know which claims you can count on so that when you're buying seed, when you're buying genetics, you know you're buying quality. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about return on investment. What does it cost to plant Abound? Not just for the seed cost, but for the production methods. And what does it cost to plant feminized seed or feminized seedlings or clones? So we'll talk a little bit about that as well. So let's jump in. Where we like to start is first thinking about how do you choose genetics? A lot of people in the CBD world, especially with the gold rush times of last year and 2018 and all the big money supposedly that was to be made in hemp and CBD, the number one question, and sometimes the only question, was what is the CBD percent in your seed? That's an important question, but we would argue not the most important question, and definitely not the only question that you should ask. So we focus on 4 key considerations that we would encourage you to think about when you're choosing your genetics for your farm. Those 4 are agronomic traits. High germ is key. So if you've bought some excellent seed, potentially, and they're telling you how much potential it has, but you're only getting a 20% germ like we talked about with the feminized seed, maybe a 70% germ with some of the seedlings and clones that are out there, you're already limiting your maximum potential yield for your farm. So that's a huge piece, is what kind of breeding has gone into the seed, how many years of breeding, how many crosses, and understanding that piece. The company that you're working with should be able to share data and actual information with you on that. Second huge piece is compliance. The total THC, as you know, has to be less than 0.3%. Each state has been regulating themselves over the last 2 years. Some states, Illinois, for example, you're allowed to have a slightly higher THC content when you harvest. And then you can blend that down after harvest. Sometimes you can also sell that seed to dispensaries, or that flower, excuse me, to dispensaries. As of October, the end of October, the USDA will take over regulation across the country. And so there won't be any state regulations anymore. There won't be state variation from one state to the next. They call it the IFR, or the interim final rule. And that says that you have to be below 0.3% THC when you harvest. Your field has to be tested by a USDA approved lab. And if it is greater than 0.3 THC, then you will have to plow your field under. So that's huge. There's lots of arguments from various sectors around the hemp world about whether 0.3% is right or wrong. We're not here to offer an opinion on that, only that as a grower in October, that rule will be enforced. So please be aware of that. Cost of production, that is a huge part of the overall cost. The seed cost is high, expensive for most seed, but the cost of production is typically greater, and that's going to make a big difference in your return on investment at the end of the season. And then finally, CBD content. So it is extremely important to think about what is the CBD content of the seed you're purchasing. However, what we have found is that companies will tell you that they have 12% CBD, 15% CBD in their genetics. Is that true? Yes, it's probably true. Is it across all of the total flower biomass? No, probably not, unless that seed is hot, unless it's over 0.3%. So if you pick the top bud, that's going to be your highest CBD content, and it could be 15% or greater CBD. If the plant overall is less than 0.3% THC, it's likely that the overall CBD content for that flower biomass is closer to 8.5, 9, maybe 10%, but not across all of it. So be careful what they're telling you when you're buying genetics, because you're not going to just want to sell that top bud. You're going to need to sell the entire biomass, flower biomass that you harvest. So we won't go into that any further, but those are the 4 key things that we really encourage you to consider when you're buying genetics. So most of you are probably familiar with the 2 different types of hemp. And one type is feminized or bushy. This is typically, these genetics came somewhat from the cannabis world, as far as the marijuana world, and they're grown like marijuana plants. Growers who have traditionally grown tobacco or vegetables are very comfortable with this type of production. Growers who have not, row crop growers who we're specifically targeting with the Bound, are really more comfortable with a seed that you can direct seed with a planter and harvest with a modified combine, and that is what a Bound is. So when you look at some of these bullets underneath, the CBD content in the feminized bushy types is typically higher than what you're going to find in a Bound, just slightly. And the reason for that is that we do want the plant to pollinate, and when you pollinate, you drop your CBD level slightly. So it can be 6 to 12% in the field with the feminized and bushy, but you have to test that THC content frequently as you get closer to harvest to make sure you're not going over 0.3. Once you hit 10% or above, the likelihood that you're going to be hot or over 0.3% is very high. So that's why we have that's in the field. A Bound is about 6.5%, 6 to 6.5% through maturity. So that's after you harvest and process that seed. And then, so we'll talk a little bit more about ROI near the end. 70 to 90% of the bushy types are non-compliant. I've started to see states, Colorado has issued slides from the Colorado Department of Ag that show, I think 2 or 3 slides that show a bunch of varieties that have proven to be hot. Other states are starting to publish those as well. So you should be able to find those. If not, ask Jen or ask us and we can provide those to you. Again, basically you're looking at around $1 a seed. Right now you're seeing seed costs drop quite a bit because the market is a little bit soft, and obviously we're now at planting. So at the end of the season, companies tend to drop their prices. So you may have found some varieties for feminized lower than that. When we look over at the Abound side, as I mentioned, enhanced agronomic traits, Rich is going to talk about breeding and so forth, which is we've been doing for 7 years. Certified varieties, AOSCA certified, and mechanically produced and genetically stable. So I won't get into too much of that because Rich is going to touch on that. But just as we kind of jump in, I wanted to share, we have a number of growers this year that are trying Abound. This is our first selling season. We have a lot of trials across the US and in Canada. And so we wanted to share a little bit about, our growers are starting to send in pictures, which is really fun. So the top is a field in Illinois of a grower who's just getting started planting and sent us a picture of the field and the New West Genetics bag as he's getting started. Then we have a grower in Washington State, and she is showing us the seed that's getting ready. It's already in the planter and getting ready to go. The planter moving across the field also in Washington State. And then we're starting to see some emergence on this farm in Kansas. Just got this picture in a couple of days ago. So you can start to see, it's a little hard to see in the picture, but you can start to see the seed starting to come up. So it's kind of exciting as we start to work with our growers, and we're going to be following them throughout the season and sharing information. You'll be able to see more on that as we go forward. So I will turn it over to Rich to talk a little bit about our breeding and genetics.
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. That last picture, just wanted to call it out. That was planted 5 days ago. To see seedlings up in 5 days is really encouraging. So pretty proud of that. Yeah, so our breeding program, as Jenny mentioned, we started in 2014, and at that time it was a brand new industry, and so our primary focus was really gathering genetic diversity and selecting for this row crop agronomy, essentially gathering as many different genotypes as we could and trying to select for adaptation to these lower latitudes. Most of the hemp grown outside of the U.S. for fiber and for grain is actually grown at higher latitudes. So most of the varieties that are imported actually aren't that well adapted, and that was really the big gap that we saw. So in the first few years of breeding, we're focused on agronomic traits, high germination rates, lack of branching, early flowering, and most importantly, less than 0.3% THC. That yielded our very first variety in WG452, which was AOSCA certified, which is basically a third-party validation that your genetics are uniform, stable, and unique. And really, the AOSCA certification is more or less a guarantee to the grower that what they're getting is of high quality, a third-party validation of that. So from there, we really had what we would call our yield platform. That's sort of the bones for creating a high-yielding crop. And then, the genetics controlling high CBD are actually, there's a lot fewer genes controlling that than there are genes controlling all of these other high yield adaptation traits. So we folded those in, and what we have today is what you're hearing about, Abound, which is in the process of being verified. Part of the certification process here in Colorado is we hand off our seed to the Department of Ag. They grow it at multiple locations and independently guarantee that the THC is compliant. Jenny mentioned or showed a map with all the different locations we're growing Abound at this summer. That's a seed lot we produced last summer, and seeing germination rates well over 90%, which is, I guess, part of why I had to skip back to that emergence picture, because the proof is in the pudding. So.
And Rich, I don't know, I'm going to go back one more time if people can see it, because you have to look close at your screen though in that picture. you can see that there's a high percentage of plants coming up at the same time also, because a number of growers have shared with us that sometimes it takes a period of days or even a week as all the plants are coming up at slightly different times. So
yeah, it's not the best picture. If you squint, it's there. Farmers
yes.
aren't necessarily the best photographers. I
Kind of
know
hard
I'm
to
not.
see. We
So
didn't have a professional out there.
that's right.
But he's trying.
Right. Yeah, I guess I've talked quite a bit about this already, the third-party validation, and that's really what we talk. I mean, anyone can post data on their website. Who knows how good that is? And we like to hand our seed off to others and let them validate it for us, because it means a lot more from someone else's mouth than it does from your own. So I talked about THC compliance with the Department of Ag. We at this point are among, if not the longest running U.S. hemp breeding program today, and that's really what's led to some of the success we're seeing. So I guess we can get into the agronomy now. This is really what people are interested in. As Jenny showed in one of her first slides, most people, when they look at production of cannabinoids, see these low density fields, 3,000 to 5,000 plants, and there's these small to large Christmas trees. And so we're really promoting this direct seeded row crop production approach to take advantage of the many decades of agronomic experience that the world has in growing hemp for grain, but also by mechanizing it and taking advantage of machinery that's already on farms today, we can drop the cost of production, and which is a absolute necessity given where the market's at today. So, as I said, we're promoting direct seeding. Really, any of the common row spacings used in the lower 48 today can be used to grow a bound. We recommend anywhere from 1 to 2 inch seed spacing within the row. So your final plant population is going to be dictated by which row spacing you choose. And I'll discuss the implications of that later. I do have listed here a couple of different planting units, a Great Plains drill and a Case IH planter, but really any planter or grain drill should be adjustable to plant hemp. You may need to buy new plates for your planter, but in general, most of them are amenable to it. I think probably the bigger point on this slide is weed control. Since hemp hasn't been around here in the US for very long, there actually aren't any synthetic selective herbicides labeled for it today, which means we have to go back to some of the traditional means, mechanical means of managing weeds.
And Rich, we've got a slide on that too with a little bit more detail.
Yeah, right here. So as I talked about, your row spacing is going to sort of set your path for how you intend to manage weeds. So if you go with these narrow rows, 7.5 to 15, you're really going to be relying on a good pre-plant management system, pre-plant burn down, good tillage, and then getting to canopy as quickly as possible. So we've seen a bound canopy in around 25 days on 7.5 inch rows, 35 days for 15-inch rows. And if you choose to go with a more traditional corn setup, you're going to be looking at about a 50-day canopy. But the upside there is you do have the ability to cultivate. And so that's what this picture on the upper right-hand side is. This is actually a picture taken from one of our fields last week. You can see the sweeps in between the rows controlling weeds, and then he's actually added some finger cultivators, which are working within the row and plucking young weed seedlings out of the row, and it seems to work really, really good. So we've seen you can get 2 passes through the field, two cultivations through the field prior to flowering, and has done a really good job of managing weeds. And there certainly seems to be an adequate workaround until we get some herbicides labeled. Yeah, and so once this crop is canopied, I mean, it outcompetes the weeds. There's not enough light penetrance for appreciable weed to grow. So.
All right, let's see here. For some reason, it's not advancing. There we go.
Okay, so just a couple pictures. Again, a picture's worth a lot more words than I can say. So these are pictures from the Abound production field last summer. These are both in organic fields. So at 39 days, I think that's actually 32 days. We need to get that fixed. But that's 32 days on the left side there. And then you can see, as I said, around 50 days, you start to get to canopy. And the weed control is more or less done at that point. At which point we are actually starting to see a little bit of flowering. There is a male I can see in there.
Yep, sticking up right there.
You got it.
I saw him too.
So as far as inputs, the simple takeaway is a relatively low input cropping system, similar to a spring wheat crop. Not a whole, it's certainly less than a high yielding corn crop. We do look at this as a true dual purpose crop. As we said, there are males in this population. The females will be seeded, and we're seeing that the grain yields are comparable to a field you were growing simply, specifically for grain, but you have this added bonus of, if you choose to, of collecting the flour, the high CBD flour that we bred for, and taking that to a separate market. That said, if you do choose to make it dual purpose, there are some challenges. Basically, growing the crop from planting through to harvest is very much like growing any other row crop, but at harvest, that's where things get a little bit interesting, and there are some challenges which we'll address here in the next few slides. Just to get a sense of what the crop looks like right around, it's typically 105 to 110 day crop here in Colorado. So this is just before harvest time, but you can see this, if you take any one of these plants, it's certainly not going to yield as well as one of the large bushy plants, but on a per square area basis, the yields are comparable, if not better. And again, the row crop agronomy outweighs any yield challenges. So as far as harvest, there are two major considerations we just want to call out straight from the get-go. When you're harvesting the flour, it's going to be 70 to 75% moisture, and we'll need to start drying. You need to get it into a dryer, which is why we're on this webinar with our friends at IEC. It needs to be dried as soon as possible because it will begin to spoil rapidly. And then the other is trichome preservation. So trichomes are these little hairs on the flower here, makes the flower look a little bit frosty there. Those are actually the primary site of cannabinoid biosynthesis, and they are little and fragile and easy to lose. And so once you lose them, you lose cannabinoid content and you lose quality of your crop. So really all operations need to consider their retention. Couple main things: less handling is better. Each time you handle it, you will lose some. And once the flour is too dry, they become even more fragile and will float away. And so will some of your dollars. So as far as harvest methods, kind of dictated by where you live, the options you have. So here in Colorado, we have a nice dry climate and have successfully field dried our crop, essentially windrowed it, let it sit in the field for a few days, and then came through with a pickup, a combine with a pickup header modified to collect a seed flower bulk. And I'll talk about, you don't want seed in your flower when you market it and vice versa. So we need to separate those things. And I'll talk about those in a coming slide. That does eliminate the drying cost, but there is a risk there. As I said, when the flower gets too dry, the trichomes are susceptible to loss. And if they blow away out in the field, you will not recover them. If you do some of your processing indoors, you can set up bag houses, and there are different ways to recover that lost. It just looks like dust, but it's very, very expensive dust. So there are ways to recover it when you do your work indoors. Other methods, and so these would be more straight cut methods of harvest, more appropriate for more humid environments where infield drying isn't an option. Seeing the stripper header used a lot these days. A stripper header is essentially was designed for cereal grains, wheat and barley. Essentially has little fingers on it that pluck the cereal grain off of the stalk, and that's exactly why it's being used in hemp. I didn't mention it, but one thing you definitely want to avoid is pushing. You want to push as little biomass through your combine as possible. Even in these non-fiber types, the fiber is strong and it will find wrapping points in a combine. So the stripper head sort of alleviates that by plucking it off of the fiber or the stalk and leaving that in the field. And then finally, a much more brute force approach is a forage harvester. Basically chop everything up and put it into a cart and bring it in to dry and separate it all later. One other method that is not mentioned here is basically direct cutting it with a straight grain header. That's what this picture in the middle bottom is the back end of a John Deere S-Series combine. And this is actually an invention from a company in Nebraska called FarmMax. They've created this bolt-on attachment, which has the ability to separate seed and flower on combine in the field. And so you end up with grain in the grain bin, and flour goes into this cart behind the combine, and you can see it's an enclosed system. They're very much aware of the need to retain the trichomes. And these guys have been modifying combines for harvesting weird stuff for decades now. They created combines that harvest these really high value wild flower species. And so this modifying combines is what they do. And it seems they're onto something really useful here. So I did say there is some post-harvest processing required, drying being one of those. IEC, go to them, learn about drying. I'm not the expert. Flower separation. So if you don't have the FarmMax interceptor that I just talked about, likely you're harvesting a seed flower fiber bulk, and so you definitely need to separate these things to retain the quality of your flower and your seed. The good news is there's technology that exists today to do this effectively and actually quite efficiently. We used a system, just a relatively small scale system here in our program last fall. Ran as seed flower bulk, ran it through a rotary screen to get some of the larger fiber material out, and then through an aspirator, which really effectively separated seed and flower. And we were really, really, really happy with the results. This bottom bullet point here, calculating loss at each step. You know, I said the more times you handle this material, the more times, the more chances there are for those trichomes to fly away. And this is where these kinds of processes being done indoors, you can set up those bag houses, collect all that dust, and add it back on the back end is actually quite advantageous.
I think we got that backwards, so I'll just kind of skip that one.
Cool.
This actually, I think, Rich, yeah, I think this just kind of starts us back into, it hits a couple of the points that we already talked about a little bit earlier around the differences between feminized and bushy, but we get into a little bit around yield here. So on this slide, we talk about yield for a bound being between 1,000 to 1,200 pounds per acre for flower. It can be higher than that. It depends. It can be lower than that, right? So this is just an average. Yield for grain, 1,170 to 1,350 pounds per acre. And Rich already mentioned germ percent is 90% plus. On our germ test for this lot of a bound for this year, it was 97%. So we're really excited about our high germination rates and high yield on top of that. For the feminized and bushy, where the yield tends to suffer is really around, it depends highly on what your germination is. So you can get a higher yield if you're getting great germ. Obviously, if you're not, it's going to drop your germ pretty substantially. So we'll look at that with an ROI calculator I've got here to show you in just a second. The biggest savings here is that with a bound being a dioecious variety, you're not hand weeding. You're hand weeding potentially in the beginning, but as Rich showed, you know, we've got cultivation methods. There's other ways to go about preparing your beds in advance. There could be some hand weeding with 7.5 inch or 15-inch rows, but it's minimal. The biggest thing is not roguing the males, because obviously we want those males in there, and that takes a lot of time to get out there. Some farmers are going out every day. And the other big area is not having to test for THC levels frequently as you get closer to harvest. So what we've got is we've got a spreadsheet. I can alter any numbers if anybody wants to put other numbers in here, but let me explain to you how we put this together. And it just gives you a little bit of an idea on costs and return. So this top part of the spreadsheet is around hemp flower, and the bottom or middle part is around yield for grain. This gray area down here is around fiber. We don't have a lot of, as I mentioned, data on fiber, so we don't put any numbers in here, but there could be some potential revenue there. We'll have more information on that at the end of this season. So if we go back to the top, we put in feminized seedlings. These could be clones or seedlings, direct seeded, feminized, and then a bound. Expected yield on the before you get your results from germination and your decrease. Expected yield 1,400 on flower, 1,400 pounds on flower for both of these methods, and then 1,350 on a bound. At a 70% germ rate is what we plugged in for the feminized seedlings, 30% for the direct seeded, and 95% for a bound. Again, we can adjust any of these. I have had farmers tell me there's a slightly higher, sometimes slightly lower. So once you multiply the 1,400 times the 70, just to get a feel for how this works, then your actual achieved yield, so it's great about what's expected, but your achieved yield is 980, 420, or 1283. Then your CBD percent comes into play. I put 8.5% in for the feminized and 6.5% for a bound. Again, if you get to 10, 9.5 to 10, the likelihood that you could go hot is very high. Doesn't mean that you can't get to 10 and still not be compliant, because you can. It's just less likely the higher your CBD content goes. Then we plugged in labor costs, and where we got these, as I mentioned, we've spoken to 650 plus farmers this season in the last 3 months. And I asked most of them, I'd say the majority, 95% plus, planted seedlings or clones. And so I asked them, how much was your labor cost? They have to put down the plastic mulch. They have to, go out, and even though there are some mechanized planters, you still have to have a few people on that planter feeding those seedlings in, reloading, and so forth. Once it's planted, walking the fields for weeds, roguing the males, as we've already talked about, etc. When they added up those costs, people told us anywhere from, on the very lowest end, I think we heard from one farmer, $8,000, but the majority were $10,000 to $15,000, just labor, not counting their seed cost. So we put in 13 and 11 because direct seeded would be less. Direct seeded would be a lot less if you didn't have to do the roguing of the bales and the testing for the THC, etc. And so what's the seed price? We've got $1.50 a seed in here for Seedlings, 50 cents for seed, and we do not price a bound on seed or per pound. So we don't have a price there. We price it per acre, which we've got in the next column, 2 columns over. So then what's your population that you're planting? 3,000 is typical, sometimes up to 5,000 for seedlings. Could be 7,000 or higher for direct seeded. And then we recommend 125,000 seed count per acre if you're planting 30-inch rows. What's your seed price then? You can kind of see how when you multiply that out where your seed price comes in. A bound is $3,000 an acre, but this year we've offered buy 1 acre, get 1 free because it's our first year selling and we want to get trial on farms in as many states as we can across the Midwest so people can really touch it and see it and feel it and experience it. So that's why you'll see 1,500 in there for a bound this year. And then, so what is your total cost per acre? This gives you a little bit of an idea, 17,500, 14,500, 2,000 in this example. And I want to keep stressing that because what we try to do when Rich and I are on calls and Daniel with individual farmers or individual farms or small groups, we'll go through and adjust these numbers to whatever people actually saw. And we can do that with you if you're interested. Pop me an email or a text. Same with Jen, she can pass that along and we can share this and walk through it with you. And then you get over to, I just used an example of if you could get $1 per % per pound on the market today. That also varies. A year ago, it was $7 per % per pound. In 2018, it was $40 per % per pound. So we used $1. And so it would be, in this first example with feminized, it would be 8.5 times 980 pounds. So that gets you to 83.30. In the case of the seedlings, or direct seeded for feminized, 8.5 times 420 gets you to 35.70. And in the case of a bound, 6.5 times 1283 gets you to 83.36. So that's how you got those numbers for your pounds per %. Then it's just $1 is what we used just for simple math. And then we took this, okay, so here's what you're making per acre for each of these methods. Subtract your total cost from that. And you can see that you're losing money in both the first 2 scenarios. You're gaining $6,000 in the bound scenario at only $1 per % per pound price. So you're still making money even in today's pricing with a bound. And the primary reason is a couple things: high germ and low labor cost. Those are the 2 things that really drive. CBD % makes a difference. And if you remember the earlier slide that we shared with the 4 different things you want to ask about when you're considering your genetics, CBD percentage is a big important piece, but it's not your only piece. With a bound, because we're pollinating the seed with the males, you're going to also have a grain revenue potentially. Today, the grain prices are over here. As we've looked at the markets, about 55 cents per pound for conventional grain and $1.10 for organic. We do have a bound in both conventional and organic, and so that gives you slightly higher revenue stream. We did count some additional cost for separating the seed. That cost is there as well for feminized because there's no such thing as 100% feminized. So you still, when you harvest, growers are telling us they still have to separate seed at harvest. So there's still some cost there. It's not as much seed that they're separating. And as I mentioned, the bottom is fiber. So our hope is that next year or the year after, you'll have potentially a tri-revenue stream crop instead of just a dual revenue stream crop. So that is really, Jen, the bulk of what we have. We can take some questions. I can just flip through here quickly. We have our COAs, which we really recommend that you, and our germ test that we recommend that you request from any company that you're going to buy seed from. So this shows you our 97% germ from the Colorado lab. We also have our THC tests from Colorado as well, 0.21 in this example on this report. And then we also have our COAs, so our certificates of analysis, and these break down all of the different levels of cannabinoids and other things within the plant that, when it's gone off for testing. We can make these available to anybody that would like them. I'm not showing you this to expect you to be able to read it because it's tiny. It's more just, it's there. We can provide those to you, but make sure you ask any seed company that you're working with for things like this. And Jen, that's really what we have. So if you want to tell us what questions, if any, that you have.
Perfect. Thank you, Jenny and Rich. We don't have too many questions, so if anybody does have questions, this is a great time. I know they covered a lot of really good information here, so this is a great time to add any questions. So this first question came a little while ago. It says, do you start these in a greenhouse or direct seeded into the fields? I think that was when you were showing some of the pictures right after the ones that the farmers had sent you.
Yeah. Rich, you want to talk about that?
Yeah, this is a direct seeded variety. So on the low end, we're recommending, so if you're planting on 30-inch rows, you're still going to be putting 125,000 seeds per acre in. And if you're going with tighter row spacing, you're going to be 500,000 seeds an acre. So direct seed for sure.
And that's why we did want to show, Jen, the pictures of the farmers, as you mentioned, showing that they've got the seed bag out there, they're loading their planter, and they're going straight out across the field. And it's, for row crop growers, this is a great approach because this is what you're used to, right? If you're planting corn, if you're planting beans, if you're planting cotton, whatever it might be, this is your approach. So it works out really well.
Right, very true. Okay, great. Now we are getting some more questions in. We do have one actually coming from Facebook. It says, can hemp be grown in the same field in back-to-back years?
Rich?
Yes, it can. And actually, it's not necessarily advised from a disease or pest management scenario, but we are in the early days of producing this crop, so there aren't many diseases or pests, and it is one of the few crops you probably could get away with that. But that said, it's back-to-back cropping like that is a great way to encourage that to happen. So we don't necessarily advise it.
And just to maybe add to that, so my background, I came out of the DeKalb and Asgrow business for quite a long time. And with corn, you look at central Illinois, parts of Indiana, Iowa, great areas to grow corn. And there was times when corn prices were very high, which were amazing back in 2010, 11, 12. Farmers would plant corn season after season after season. And as you know, if you've planted corn, I mean, that does increase your insect pressure dramatically. Same with soybeans. I also worked with farmers in Missouri, southern Indiana, very high soybean growing areas, and they would want to go back-to-back beans. Same issue. So because hemp is so new, hemp's only been legal to grow for 2 years. As Rich said, there's not a lot of pests that it's susceptible to or that we're aware of yet, but over time, and especially if you're going back-to-back for very many seasons, you may see that.
You will.
You will.
You will see it. Okay, good. Thank you, guys. Next question. How does Abound respond to regions that are more wet than the Midwest?
That's a really good question. Don't have a good answer today. I guess it depends on where you're at in the Midwest. I think it might be hard to get wetter than some of those places, but we did grow in South Carolina last year, and the crop looked really exceeded my expectations. And almost no irrigation there, so time will tell. You can see the number of locations we have here. We're really vetting the broad adaptation of Abound this summer, so I'll have a much better answer then.
Perfect. Yeah, that makes sense. Good. So next question is, what is the total THC for Abound?
So on average, less than 0.3. We typically see the low 0.2s. The higher end is 0.26 at this point.
Great. All right, let's see here. All right, we have a question from Ben. Should farmers contract production for the CBD and seed, or is it best to grow without?
I can help him with that one. So from a sales and marketing perspective, if I've got an option to have a contract to sell or not, I would definitely want to have a contract. I think it depends on the type of contract that you get and from whom. So I think we found in 2019, there were lots of contracts out there, lots of people willing to contract with growers and offer them many, many things. The unfortunate part in 2019 that happened was by harvest, some of those people had gone out of business, gone bankrupt, and they no longer existed. So there's no such thing as no risk. If you grow hemp, if you grow corn, if you grow soybeans, you're going to take risk. Farmers are risk takers by their very nature. But if you can figure out what your market is, where are you going to sell, whether it's on contract or you're working with an extractor closely or a grain grain purchaser, knowing where you're going to sell that crop is very, very beneficial. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. All right. Next question. Do these have any issues with cross-pollination?
No, not really. I mean, I think if there's a field adjacent that has pollen, certainly the harvested seed, some of that would have been pollinated by the adjacent field. So you wouldn't want to, and nor would our contract allow you, replant the seed because it wouldn't be genetically pure.
Mm-hmm.
It would pollinate a feminized field within the area, though. There's going to be a tremendous amount of pollen, and it will seed out adjacent feminized fields for sure.
So we usually recommend a minimum of 3 miles up to 10 miles, depending on winds, etc. Richard,
as much as possible.
As much as possible. I mean,
Yeah.
You're not going to want to plant it side by side with feminized if that's the primary question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that answered it. All right. You guys are asking great questions. What is included in 500 production cost estimate?
Okay. Good question. Let me just jump over to, sorry for jumping around, but I think sometimes it helps to have that in front of us. So the $500 labor cost, what we're including in there is the cost to load and run your planter across the field. This doesn't count fuel costs, et cetera. This is labor only. So we're really looking at how much does it cost for you to have a person and how many people does it take? So for example, if you're running a planter to plant a bound, it's one person on a planter. If you're running any kind of mechanized equipment to plant seedlings or clones, it's typically 2 to 3 people, and they're feeding more clones in, and you've got to hand load them and so forth. So it might be a mechanized planting method with the machine, but you're still hand loading them, et cetera. So typically that's 2 to 3 people. The other pieces that went into labor are how much time are you spending walking the fields, roving males? With a bound, it's 0. With the others, it's daily. Also, how much time are you spending doing your THC testing a month out, a week out? And some people do it every single day to test the THC levels before harvest. I'm not saying you should not ever do it with a bound. If it makes you feel more comfortable, you definitely should. But with feminized, you're typically doing it on a daily basis the closer you get to harvest. So those are the things that went into that cost. It is specifically labor, though, so it's not fuel and some of those other costs. And it is an estimate. I mean, this is one of the reasons that we love to go through this with a specific grower, because they might say, no, my costs are $700. My costs are $400 or whatever that might be.
Right, yeah, that's a great tool. Excellent. All right, we have another question coming from Facebook. It says, are you seeing more or less acres of hemp grown this year versus last year?
So I don't have data from each state, but I would tell you from the folks that we talk to extension people, we talk to the departments of ag folks, and we talk to farmers. It would appear, not necessarily from how many acres that people have licenses to grow on, but how many acres that people believe they're going to grow on, that it is going to be less. I mean, as I talk to farmers, I've talked to a number of folks in Michigan, Illinois, Kansas, Kansas didn't grow last year, Missouri, that say that they're going to be growing less acres than they grew last year. Some farmers have said they're not going to grow any. Now, there are some that we've also spoken to that are going to grow it for the first time this year. So it's not that everybody's going down. I think there's nervousness about the softness of the market right now, and where am I going to sell the flour? Where am I going to sell the grain?
Yeah, definitely. All right. Next question. Is there any studies on a bound's food quality traits, flavor, nutrition, etc., better for oil or hemp parts?
Rich, from a data perspective from trials, I'm not sure we have a lot on
So
that.
we've tested fatty acid profiles, amino acid profiles. Those are not different from other grain varieties, so they're not appreciably different. As far as flavor, we have not. That's more of a subjective sensory type approach, and I think varies by processor whether or not the flavor is good or bad. So we don't have any information on that, although I think we are submitting samples to some of those processors now. But really what I can say is one of the parents of this variety is our original grain variety, which has gotten positive feedback from processors. So we don't expect it to be appreciably different.
Yeah, we're submitting some samples for a couple of examples, to Victory Hemp in Kentucky and IND in Montana. Both have requested samples, so we're in the process of getting that taken care of, and then they will be testing for how easy is it for them to process the seed, as well as taste and some of the other attributes within the seed.
Interesting. Very cool. All right. So far this is our last question. So if anybody has any more questions, this is a great time to add it in. Laverne asks, please describe the variety of harvest techniques experienced with your genetics last year across the country. How different has it been by region?
Yeah, so we really did our first seed increase of a bound last year. So it hasn't been grown in appreciable volumes across the U.S. yet. What we did do a couple of different harvest methods here in Colorado last year. One was the forage chopper approach, which we don't recommend. There was poor seed quality on the back end, and I think a fair amount of loss as the stream of silage was blown into the cart. The other method we used was this windrowing approach I described during my talk, where we field dried it, came through with a modified combine and picked up the windrow and essentially harvested the seed flower bulk. That worked relatively well. We did learn that our windrow, we were forced to cut too low on the plant, so there was more fiber running through the combine than is ideal. So that's where that recommendation comes from. Our belief and feedback from agronomists, university agronomists we've talked to across the country is as you move eastward and humidity goes up, the windrowing field drying approach is obviously not going to work. And right now we're most bullish on that Farm Max interceptor that's direct cutting it and separating seed from flower in the field.
Great. All right, we have a few more questions that came through. One is, how does the quality of oil presses from the seed differ from varieties grown for only grain?
Good question, Rich. What do you think?
I don't have a good answer. We're still getting the market feedback on our grain qualities, but like I said, one of the parents is that grain type, our first AOSCA certified grain type. So I think it should have decent grain quality, whether that be for, I don't know well what differentiates a hemp heart type versus a good hemp oil type.
We're going to learn a lot this year with all the different trials we have out there and all the folks that we're talking to. So these are fantastic questions. One of the things I found surprising when I came in from a row crop background with corn and soybeans is where I spent most of my career. And I came into the hemp world working with Rich and the team back in early this year, is that many of the questions that you ask around corn or soybeans or a more established crop, people have great answers. They have data, they have information on that. Our answers typically are, we don't know, we're learning, we'll let you know soon.
That's so true, right? Yeah, and you guys are in the industry for a while, so I know you'll get those answers for us.
We're learning.
Right?
I'm really happy to see people asking questions about the grain and
Yeah.
downstream markets. It's not just all about CBD and the gold rush, because people are going to continue eating for as long as we're around, and that source of nutrition is going to be a longer term market, I think.
Definitely. Yeah, that's so true. All right, it looks like we have one last question. So someone mentioned that CBD content is lowered slightly with pollination. Do you know how much it is lowered?
Yeah, so we've done that experiment. It can be as much as 2%, but it does vary by genotype. So some genotypes are more susceptible to loss when seeded than others. Ours, we have bred the variety to contain seeds from the start. So in general, our varieties are much less susceptible to that. The number we're advertising is a seeded number.
And one of the things I would just maybe reinforce that Rich talked about already is the importance of breeding. So Rich has been breeding Abound and various genetics at New West Genetics for the last 7 years. And so selecting specifically for characteristics that we now are very excited to have on the market. So those things like vigor, germ, making sure that plant is going to have a great stand, making sure that we're going to have low THC. So selecting and doing trials and testing just like that. That's a great question. When you pollinate, how much does it go down? Well, let's select and those characteristics and traits when we move forward that are going to reduce that amount. And in fact, we're looking at in our pipeline that THC percent is going to go up in the next couple of years as we go forward, and the THC level will go down. So higher CBD, lower THC, and that's what's really exciting. And that comes from breeding. So again, when you're talking about genetics and you're talking to different companies, there's some very good companies out there. There's also some very sketchy companies out there. So ask a lot of questions. If they've not been breeding for more than a year or two, they're not able to select for these different traits that Rich and the team have.
Right, exactly. Yeah, we've heard lots of stories where people have bought seed and then, a few months later they can't be found, right?
They disappeared.
Yep, exactly. Okay, so we have the last question, and this is the perfect one to end on here, is how many acres of Abound are being grown in the 2020 season? What do you guys think?
That's a great question. So we had, as Rich said, we had a very limited amount of seed to sell this year. And so our goal was not to put high quantities on any one farm. And actually, as you're just learning how to grow hemp in general, we don't recommend going super big. But we are going to be in, if we go back to our map, we're going to be in something like 16 states between trial as well as purchase. And so I would have to give a guess. I don't have a specific number off the top of my head, but we only had 1,000 acres to sell total. We did not sell all of it, but we did sell quite a bit of it, probably well over half. So I'd say you're going to see us in a lot of states. We are also going to be promoting a lot of events, whether webinars or, following farmers in the field, and hopefully doing some live Facebook feeds and social media and so forth. We're looking to do a harvest field day in Fort Collins at our facility. Probably in early September, and we're looking to do a field day in Northern Illinois sometime in August. So we'll keep you all posted on that, and we'll be putting information out about that.
Awesome. That's super exciting, Jenny and Rich. Well, thank you guys so much for joining us. You've shared so much helpful information and applicable too. So we'll get this up on YouTube, and I'll be sure to send everybody who's here watching the recording of it along with Jenny and Rich's contact info if you would like to reach out to them. Be sure to give us all a follow on YouTube or Facebook to stay up to date with more upcoming webinars. And then next week, we will be taking a break from our webinars. IEC Thermo will be at Summer Solstice, which is being put on by NOCO. It's free to register and attend, so come find us and say hello. We'd love to talk with you further about our hemp dryers or answer any questions you may have. And then also next week, Thursday, IEC team member Shauna will also be on one of the Oregon Hemp Convention Digital Summits outdoor farming panel. It'll be next week, Thursday, June 18th at 2 p.m. Pacific. Once again, it's free to register and attend. and attend. It looks like there's lots of good speaking sessions, so be sure to check it out. And Jenny and Rich, thank you guys both so much. We're really glad to partner with you guys, and so thankful that you could be joining us here today.
Thanks, Jen, and we appreciate
thanks for the
work
opportunity.
at IPC. Appreciate it.
Yeah, definitely. All right, thanks everybody. Thanks for joining us, and we'll hope to see you back soon.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.